Racine was named by French explorers and first settled by Yankees. Ethnic diversity has always been its hallmark. Racine has been called both the most Danish city in America and the Czech Bethlehem. Within its borders have been such diverse place names as English Settlement, Scotch Settlement, Little Armenia, Norway, Polonia, Bronzeville, and the Barrio. Despite its original Yankee foundations, the first permanent settler in the city was a German immigrant, popularly known as Dutch Pete. He and his fellow newcomers constituted nearly 40% of the county's population by 1850. They and their children accounted for over 70% by 1870. At the turn of the century, the foreign-born and their immediate descendants were an astounding 78% of the county's people. Even as late as 1930, they remained nearly 60%. Small wonder that the major downtown stores hired bilingual clerks to deal with their foreign language customers. Despite the ending of mass immigration in the 1920s, there were still almost 12,000 county residents of foreign birth in 1950, over 10% of the total population. In 1973, 15% of Racine's population were still immigrants or their children, who came from all over the world. Since World War II, Racine's growth has been fueled largely by blacks and Spanish-speaking people. From that first German immigrant to the latest Negro or Chicano, ethnic and racial minorities have enriched the county and the city with their diverse cultures and skills, and have formed a similar process of adjustment to urban industrial life. Hello, I'm John Buenker. Racine's immigrants came in three fairly distinct waves over the past 140 years. The first segment, the old immigration, came mostly from the British Isles, Scandinavia, Germany, Bohemia, and the smaller countries of northwestern Europe between 1840 and 1900. The Germans were the largest immigrant group prior to 1870. They and the English, Welsh, Scots, Irish, and Norwegians came in large numbers beginning in 1840, joined by the Bohemians in the 1850s. The Danes came steadily up to 1870 and then dominated immigration for the next 40 years. When vaudeville comedians asked, "Where was Racine 10 years ago?" the answer came back, "In Denmark." The magnitude of the old immigration slowed noticeably after 1900, but Northern and Western Europeans continued to contribute substantially to Racine's population by rearing large families. Although precise figures are not available, it is likely that the descendants of these old immigrants still constitute close to 1/2 of the county's population. With the onset of the 20th century, the source of European immigration to Racine shifted dramatically south and east, to the Baltic and Mediterranean countries, and the vast multinational empires of Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey, with their oppressed minorities of Poles, Lithuanians, Slovaks, Serbo-Croatians, Armenians, and Jews. Before 1900, this new immigration had contributed only about 400 individuals to Racine County's population. In the next 3 decades, it provided nearly 8,000. Although the shifting boundaries in Eastern Europe produced by World War I make it difficult to obtain precise figures for national origins, the identity of the major new immigrant groups in Racine is reasonably clear. Blacks and Spanish-speaking peoples from the South and Southwest began the final great wave of migration to Racine. Actually, there had been a small but constant black community in the city since before the Civil War. The 1838 city directory recorded 10 people of color, while the 1850 census listed 67 blacks in the county, and the 1860 census 135. 14 blacks from Racine served in the Civil War. Between that conflict and the First World War, the black population of the city remained fairly steady, approximately 100, and the small immigration brought on by the availability of wartime jobs tripled the number by 1920. Even as recently as 1940, the black population of Racine County totaled fewer than 500, mostly old families that had resided there for decades. The expanding economy of the Second World War, however, triggered a mass migration of blacks from the southern states and even Barbados that continues to the present day. Although it has been estimated that there were several thousand blacks in Racine during the war, The permanent population stabled at about 2,500 people by 1950. By 1962, its size had more than doubled, and by 1968, the number passed the 10,000 mark. By 1975, there were about 12,000 blacks in Racine County, totaling nearly 7% of the county population. The influx of Spanish-speaking peoples came even later. There had been migrant farm workers coming to the county since the 1890s, but most of them found the climate too cold to establish permanent residence. Most of these were Mexican Americans, but small groups of Puerto Ricans came to Racine after 1910, mostly to earn enough money to move to a larger city. From the 1920s on, a small trickle of Mexican Americans came to work on the railroads. But as late as 1940, there were still only 61 Mexican-born residents of the county. 10 years later, the total had barely changed. By 1958, however, there were 200 families living just south of the city limits in Sheridan Woods. By 1965, there were an estimated 4,000 Spanish-speaking people in the county, and by the mid-1970s, the number had swollen to 5,733, or 3.3% of the total population. Together, blacks and Spanish-speaking peoples constituted nearly 11% of the county's residents. The reason for this almost continuous pattern of immigration varied for both individuals and ethnic groups, but everyone involved was motivated by a combination of the socioeconomic, political, and religious situation that pushed refugees from their homeland and pulled them to America. The European immigrants who entered the country were part of the more than 37 million persons who migrated to the United States between 1830 and 1924. Religious persecution motivated such diverse groups as Scandinavian dissenters, Russian Jews, and Armenian Christians. The established Lutheran Church demanded that dissenters pay taxes to support it and refused to allow the practice of any other religion. The Russians excluded Jews from many professions, occupations, and educational institutions, segregated them into ghettos and pales, and subjected them to murderous pogroms that killed tens of thousands annually. A Racine rabbi later recalled the persecutions, adding that the indifference of the so-called educated Russians hurt me more than the drunken orgies of the hooligans. Turkish Muslims slaughtered an estimated 1.5 million Armenian Christians between 1895 and 1917 and drove 600,000 others into the desert. Only about 400,000 escaped to the United States. Many other Europeans fled because of political oppression, as did the 48ers after the failure of the liberal national revolutions in Germany and Bohemia in 1848. Nearly every Eastern European nationality was oppressed by the Russian, Austro-Hungarian, or Turkish empires and had little or no political voice. Young men in nearly every country were subject to universal military service. One Lithuanian escaped across the German border under fire from Russian soldiers who wanted to conscript him. Even where they were not ruled by foreigners, as in Norway, there was a widespread feeling of suspicion and distrust among the common folk against the officiating class. Probably most important of all, people fled the old world because it no longer offered a means of earning a decent living or provided any hope of social betterment. Changes in agriculture, combined with a large birth rate, left millions of farmers with plots of land too small to yield a living or too heavily taxed to retain. Large numbers were reduced to the status of sharecroppers or fled to the rapidly growing cities, where they added to the already existing surplus of labor. The Industrial Revolution destroyed the livelihood of craftsmen and forced workers to labor long hours at low wages under dangerous and insecure conditions. No matter what the time of its immigration to Racine, every nationality cited a mixture of reasons, although economic motives usually were the most consistent. An early Cornish miner reminisced that if I could have found employment at home, I should undoubtedly have remained in England. But having acquaintances who had emigrated to America, I decided to follow them. Another refugee declared that every available bit of land in Scotland was developed and put under cultivation long ago, and the man who wanted a bit of property of his own could not find it in the old country. A student of Scandinavian migration concluded that increasing pressure of the population upon scanty resources, religious persecutions, lack of voice in the government, and a hopeless outlook made it impossible to remain. Norwegians fled poverty and religious persecution, coupled with the overbearing manners of the official aristocracy, who charged large fees for small services, making advancement impossible for the ambitious lower classes. Danes left for a mixture of economic and religious reasons, especially because of the too pronounced reproduction of the working class. Most of the Danes came to win an economic freedom which seemed impossible under the existing conditions in old Denmark. Bohemian immigrants cited political oppression, militarism, low wages, overcrowded labor markets, the prospect of improving their material condition, and their love of liberty as prime reasons for leaving the homeland. Poles came to Wisconsin because of the grossly inadequate wages paid in Europe, the inability to provide family lands, the unjust restraint and oppression of Poland by the three powers, Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Russia, and religious oppression. Italians left Calabria for Racine to make a living. Southern blacks, too, fled incredible poverty as well as the absence of basic civil and human rights, while Mexican Americans left conditions in Texas and Florida migrant labor camps described by authorities as slave quarters and the prisons of the Spanish Inquisition. The push of intolerable conditions in the migrants' place of origin was more than matched by the pull of relatively attractive conditions in Racine. Not the least of these was the county's location along major transportation routes. The early European immigrants came by sailing vessel, a long and dangerous voyage fraught with the dangers of shipwreck, disease, and seasickness. One Cornish immigrant to Yorkville was so horribly seasick that when he was told that the ship was sinking, he replied weakly, "Let her go to the bottom. I wish she had gone 3 days ago." Later immigrants came by steamship in steerage, shortening the voyage by several weeks, but still leaving much of the anxiety and hardship. A 1904 Slovak immigrant became so seasick that she was still unable to look at a ship 70 years later. An Armenian immigrant remembered being piled like cattle, while a Lithuanian described his ship as being like a freight car. Clerks on board ships sold tickets for the continuing journey to Racine, but travelers were consistently warned to be on your guard against being imposed upon by a swarm of runners who infest every place along your route. Since most vessels landed at New York, prospective Racinites continued up the Hudson River to Albany, along the Erie Canal to Buffalo, and across or around the Great Lakes by boat or train. Many Irish immigrants traveled on lumber boats to Canada and down the Great Lakes. So many of them settled just north of the Root River in the old Fourth Ward that the area was known as Canada for several years. Fewer immigrants landed in New Orleans and proceeded up the Mississippi River to Wisconsin. Located so close to Milwaukee and Chicago, Racine also received many newcomers who had originally intended to settle in the larger cities, but who found greater opportunity and compatibility in the Bell City. Displaced persons after World War II came by airplane, often bound for Racine by prior arrangement with families, friends, or government agencies. Most black and Mexican Americans came by railroad and automobile from the South and Southwest. The great majority of Mexican Americans came after living for a time in Texas. Most had even been born there. Those who came directly from Mexico sometimes sneaked past the border patrol into the land of their dreams. "My mother carried me across the Rio Grande in her arms," one woman recalled, while another remembered that we came in a rowboat. Where they came from or when they arrived, Racine's immigrants were attracted primarily by economic opportunity. In the early days, land was cheap and abundant, debt non-existent, and taxes almost unbelievably low. German farmers generally could sell their land, buy passage, and have enough left to buy a farm. Scandinavians were particularly impressed with the similarity to their homeland. When Prince Frederick of Denmark visited Racine in 1939, he declared that the rich farmland, the dairy cattle, and the cozy farmhouses recalled to our minds the Danish islands. The Danes who left their home shores for a wide horizon and new lands found them amid familiar surroundings. Land was $1.25 an acre, and credit was easy to obtain. Czech immigrants found that they could pay off the mortgage in 2 years at 7% interest. "The only tax we have to pay is $6 a year," an English immigrant wrote back home. "May God bless Guernsey with all its slaves." Provisions, too, were cheap and very abundant in comparison to what they were in England. For artisans, craftsmen, and small businessmen, too, opportunity seemed almost unlimited. The city of Racine and smaller urban communities quickly became prosperous centers serving the needs of the hinterland farm population. Later in the century, the rapid growth of industry provided economic opportunity for tens of thousands of migrants. They came mostly because in Racine there are jobs. This theme was sounded by the brochures of land and immigration companies, by industrial recruiters, and by the Wisconsin Department of Immigration, which advertised the state as a haven to the middle working classes. An Irish Immigrant Aid and Colonization Society promised fellow nationals that 50 years' labor in New England or 20 years' toil in Ohio are not ample in their results to 5 industrious years in Wisconsin. Even more importantly, individual immigrants writing home to friends and relatives sang Racine's praises. The average Danish immigrant wrote about 4 letters back home each year. One letter written to a German community, a later observer noted, might spread the America fever for emigration and strip it of all the able-bodied citizens. An English immigrant wrote, "You will get on in this country if ever you should come," while a German settler declared that it is really good here, not only for people with money, but also for those who have none. An immigrant from the Channel Islands urged his aunt to tell all who were coming to America to buy land to come straight here without stopping elsewhere. Ole K. Travatern of the town of Norway penned a series of America letters that influenced many of his countrymen to come to the United States, while Rasmus Sorensen organized a letter-writing campaign by hundreds of Danes. When sickness and hardship nearly destroyed their settlement in rural Norway town, 80 residents signed a Muskego manifesto informing friends and relatives that they faced the future with confidence. Other immigrants sent letters back to newspapers urging their compatriots to follow their lead. Communications to family and friends often included remittance money and prepaid tickets for family members. Danish settlers sent an average of 500 to 800,000 kroner per year back home, and 1/3 of Danish immigrants traveled on prepaid tickets. Among Norwegians and Swedes, the figure was closer to half. The promise of economic opportunity was further sweetened by political and religious freedom and the absence of rigid class distinction. The Wisconsin Constitution granted voting rights to any adult male who resided in the state for a year and declared his intention of becoming a citizen. Such generosity justified the belief of a prominent English immigrant that there seems to be a general disposition manifested by the Americans to go hand in hand with foreigners and allow them to join in the government of town and state. Political equality paralleled social equality on the frontier, leading another English settler to write that, "In America there is no distinction. A poor man is as much respected as the richest. Behavior causes the liberty and equality." Political equality remained even after social distinctions began to form. The popular belief in both persists to the present day, whatever the reality. Freedom of worship also attracted people of a wide variety of religious persuasions, especially such persecuted minorities as Russian Jews. Many believed, with Russian Jew Albert Levin, that this is the place that God chose for me, the United States of America. Like thousands of others, Levin saw Racine as a place where economic opportunity, political liberty, and religious mission formed a happy combination. In later life, he summarized his reasons for emigrating to the area. Go to America, get a job, save up money, and go into business with one of my brothers. Marry the most beautiful Jewish girl who would bring me 2 beautiful children. Not wishing that my children go to a secular church where dogmas strange to the Jewish concept of religion are taught, I would want my children to go to a Jewish temple, free from any dogmas, and only the 10 Commandments and the ethics of the prophets are taught. Despite differences of ethnicity, time, and circumstances, black and Chicano migrants came north for most of the same reasons. As the executive director of the Milwaukee Urban League declared, blacks moved north into urban communities for the same reason other American ancestors moved to this country. The Negroes hoped to find better opportunities, establish a better life for their children, and escape the same kind of pressure which brought immigrants from Europe. Early black migrants came to establish small businesses and escape slavery and privation. Racine was a hotbed of abolitionism, an important way station on the Underground Railroad. Several hundred Racine residents marched on the federal courthouse in Milwaukee to rescue runaway slave Joshua Glover and help him escape to Canada. Later black migrants came seeking jobs in factories, the right to vote, and an end to segregation. Like earlier arrivals, many felt that they could pick up gold in the streets. When asked why she did not return to the South, a black mother replied that she wanted her children to go to school, like the white children. In a 1966 survey, 72% of blacks and 62% of Mexican Americans came to Racine because of letters or discussions with friends or relatives who had preceded them. Mexican Americans came first as migrant farm or railroad workers, and many were aided in their relocation to urban industrial life by the Merrill Labor Project in the 1960s. An agency of the Merrill Trust Fund, the Episcopal Church, and the National Catholic Rural Life Conference, the Merrill Project helped to resettle migrants in Racine and Kenosha through counseling, job placement, housing relocation, and the upgrading of vocational skills. Despite hardships and discrimination, most Chicanos later felt that they had bettered themselves by coming to Racine. Although increased economic opportunity was a major goal for all of Racine's immigrants, the time of their arrival, the skills they brought with them, and the changing nature of the economy profoundly affected the way in which they earned a living. Although America is popularly regarded as the land of individual opportunity, but ethnically based patterns of employment and social mobility have always been a fact of life. The original Yankee settlers and their descendants had the best economic opportunities and generally took full advantage of them, whether in agriculture, business, industry, or their professions. Each successive immigrant group found its choice of occupation increasingly limited by the amount of capital and skill required, the disappearance of cheap labor, the continuous centralization of business and industry, and the greater advantages in education and inheritance enjoyed by the descendants of earlier settlers. Probably the majority of the immigrants who arrived before the Civil War were able to purchase land and resume their old world occupations as farmers. The remainder often opened small businesses or pursued crafts that provided goods and services to surrounding farms. In a very real sense, wheat made Racine. The prospect of growing it on the level prairies attracted the first settlers. Their products attracted others. Those with the skills and a small amount of capital soon became craftsmen, artisans, or merchants. Many of their enterprises survived and prospered to the present, while others endured for generations before being outdated by technological change. Most of those who arrived after the Civil War, though, found that they had to work for an already established employer, hoping that either they or their children could advance to higher and more lucrative positions. By 1850, 69% of the city's labor force was blue-collar. By 1880, the total had risen to 80%. A special census in the latter year found that when the small wagon and threshing machine shops expanded, they were filled with mechanics, 9/10 of whom are of foreign birth, quietly working year after year with no ambition to take the place of American foremen. By 1880, nearly 60% of the foreign-born were engaged in mechanical and manufacturing occupations, 16% in trade and transport, 19% in other forms of labor, and only 6% in professional and personal service. Most found employment in the industries developed to serve the agricultural economy, such as wagon, farm implement, and fanning mill works, brickyards, tanneries, machine and wood shops, shipping, and railroads. Although representatives of each old immigrant nationality could be found in almost every business or industry, they did tend to concentrate, for a time at least, in certain occupations. Some of the city's major industries deliberately recruited workers of a particular nationality because of their skills, work habits, or attitudes. Englishmen and Scotsmen were frequently skilled machinists, woodworkers, carpenters, and masons. They quickly became the elite of the working class. Many Welshmen were first employed in the mills, on the railroads, or as sailors. As the Welsh moved up the ladder, they were replaced by the Irish on the tracks and the Norwegians on the sea. The Irish often came to Racine as laborers on public improvements and railroads, and continued in those occupations. The 1880 census noted that the city had quite a colony of Irish, the latter engaged in the labor of loading and unloading vessels. The Mitchell and Fish Brothers Wagon Works and the Case Farm Implements recruited in Denmark for woodworkers. Mitchell employed Danish workers almost exclusively. Finding the men active workers, they did everything to encourage the Scandinavian immigrants here. Thousands of Danes reportedly arrived, properly tagged, knowing only 3 words of near English: Vitchel Wagenwerks. The wagon and farm implements industries also attracted large numbers of Germans, and their countrymen dominated the city's sizable brewing industry during the 19th century. An English visitor in 1863 also found an unusual number of German labels and German advertisements in shop windows. The early Bohemian immigrants were mostly farmers, loggers, or shingle cutters. An increasing number came to work at the Secor Trunk and Luggage Company after 1855. Martin M. Secor was a colorful Bohemian immigrant who made it his business to hire any of his countrymen who needed a job. Legend has it that many Bohemian immigrants' first words on American soil were, "Where is Secor? I want a job." Secor pioneered high wages, unionization, and paid vacations. He quaffed beer with his employees and used his large mansion on Milwaukee Avenue as a boarding house for newly arrived workers. At one point, an entire area of Lake Avenue was called the Secor Block. The reluctance of banks to loan money to immigrants also prompted the establishment of the Bohemian Working Man's Building and Loan Association and similar businesses. The old immigrants generally enjoyed a good deal of social mobility in the rapidly expanding economy of the late 19th century. By 1880, 15% of the foreign-born were in white-collar occupations, compared with 25% of the native-born. British immigrants experienced the greatest upward mobility, followed by the Germans, Irish, Scandinavians, and Bohemians. Although immigrants still lagged behind native-born Americans in most occupations by 1880, there was less than a 5% difference between the two in the census's 4 major job categories. Still, the property owned by the foreign-born was worth less than half that of the native-born by 1870. And even among the foreign-born, the value of the property of English immigrants was nearly 3 times that of Irishmen. Clearly, British immigrants and Yankees fared better than the other old immigrant groups, but the latter were eventually pushed up the socioeconomic scale by the influx of new immigrants at the bottom of the industrial ladder. The new immigrants arrived at a time when the city was rapidly converting to heavy industry and centralizing its economy. Before the Civil War, the average establishment in the county employed about 10 or 12 people, and the 132 manufacturing establishments engaged only 807 workers. By 1919, factories employed nearly 16,000 workers. Between 1914 and 1928, the number of wage earners increased by 27%. Most of these new industries involved the manufacture of automobiles and automobile parts, rubber tires, electrical goods, leather goods, iron and steel, and machinery. The vast majority of these additional workers were the new immigrants who were pouring into the city, many because they had been specifically recruited by local industry, and others because fellow countrymen had informed them of employment opportunities. A large number were bonded to work for Case or Bell City or some other company for a stated period of time in exchange for travel expenses. Labor agents typically received about $3 a head for delivering workers to local factories. A high percentage of Italians worked at the Bell City or Lakeside foundries or at the Case South Works. Most Italians, a 1928 observer noted, did hard labor for a livelihood. They built roads and buildings, toiled in the fields, worked in the shops. Largely by the sweat of their brow, the community has prospered. The first Polish immigrants were cabinet makers, specifically recruited for their skills. But the vast majority of later arrivals found employment in factories. By 1929, a survey of nearly 500 Polish workers revealed that almost half were molders, machinists, or other laborers, while 38% were assemblers, clerks, foremen, or city workers. Only 7% owned small businesses, and only 4 individuals were professionals. Hungarian, Slovak, Lithuanian, Greek, and Armenian immigrants also largely labored in heavy industry. The work was monotonous and dangerous, the wages small, and the hours long. The typical workday was 12 hours long, 6 days a week, for $2 to $5 a week. Much of the labor was piecework, where one was paid only by the amount of work he actually turned out. In 1916, the Racine labor advocate estimated that most of the city's unskilled workers failed to meet the federal government's cost of living standard of $16.50 a week for a family of 6. The 1927 industrial survey found the average annual wage of $1,531, considerably above the average cost, and where most of the employed classes are in a position to purchase, own, and maintain a home. The average yearly income of industrial workers nationally that year was nearly $1,700. Historian John G. Gregory, however, agreed that new immigrant laborers were placed on a somewhat higher standard of living than they enjoyed in Europe, but concluded that it did not improve to the degree of those who came earlier. The only real alternative for most new immigrants was to acquire enough money through saving or borrowing to open a small business that catered primarily to the needs of their fellow countrymen or immediate neighborhood. By the 1920s, the city abounded with new immigrant grocery and fruit stores, bakeries, meat markets, restaurants, ice cream and confectionery shops, barber shops, shoe repair stores, dressmakers, tailors, laundries, dry goods, and notion stores. To provide money for prospective homeowners, a group of Poles founded the White Eagle Savings and Loan in the 1920s. Perhaps the most numerous and popular ethnic neighborhood business was the corner saloon, where the immigrant laborer could go for a cheering drink, good fellowship, and conversation in his native tongue. Saloons were poor men's country clubs. They often provided free lunches and sleeping quarters for the poor and destitute, lent money, helped find jobs, had meeting rooms for national organizations or unions, and served as clubhouses for local politicians. During Prohibition, many of these ethnic saloons became soft drink parlors, but they reopened in triumph in 1933 with the repeal of the 18th Amendment. Russian Jews in particular avoided factory work by becoming fruit or junk peddlers, scissors grinders, umbrella menders, or by opening second-hand stores. Like Fiddler on the Roof, a prominent member of the Jewish community, recalled, "The first Jewish settlers had horses and wagons and 5 or 6 children." In time, the more successful opened dry goods, notions, furniture, and department stores. Greeks operated candy stores, restaurant, and shoe repair shops, while Italians owned barbershops, restaurants, and grocery stores. One observer condescendingly described lakeside Italian food stores as hole-in-the-wall places where a few vegetables, cans of tomato paste, and bottles of olive oil give evidence of a shopkeeper. The Armenians quickly expanded into the embroidery, weaving, and rug businesses. Eventually, the majority of new immigrants achieved the higher standard of living that they had journeyed to Racine to find. Even those who remained in factories saw dramatic improvement in wages and conditions of labor due to the unionization movement of the 1930s. The trade and craft unions that were formed in the late 19th century were largely dominated by Germans, Irishmen, Bohemians, and Scandinavians, who made up the bulk of the city's skilled and semi-skilled labor force. Prominent labor leaders, such as the socialist Eugene Debs, regularly visited Racine and often spoke in such ethnically related halls as the Danish Brotherhood. The unskilled workers who toiled in the great industries built between 1880 and 1920 included many of these earlier nationalities, but increasingly consisted of Southern and Eastern Europeans. At the end of World War I, they played a major role in the generally unsuccessful attempt to unionize several of the city's major industries, and were often the victims of violence, epithets, and blacklists. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, they were still largely ununionized and were the hardest hit groups in the city. By 1930, unemployment in manufacturing and mechanical occupations had passed 10%. It constituted nearly 80% of the city's total unemployment. Immigrant and second-generation workers together made up nearly 2/3 of the unemployed. By 1933, over 5,000 families in the county were on relief, close to 20% of the total population. A town almost entirely dependent upon industry, the Milwaukee Journal noted, Racine was among the first to feel the Depression. It was the scene of the earliest relief demonstrations. Its workers were the first to organize under the NRA, with local unions springing out of unemployed organizations. Stung by rising unemployment, inadequate relief programs, and drastic wage cuts, Racine's unskilled workers, mostly of foreign stock, pressed for union recognition and touched off such a rash of strikes that the city was sometimes called Little Moscow. They also vented their frustrations by helping to elect pro-union socialist mayor William Svoboda in 1931 and 35. He was eventually defeated in 1937, partly because many voters feared the growing power of organized labor, and partly because workers felt that they made sufficient gains to prefer stability. In less than a decade, Racine had changed from an open shop to a unionized town. Over 4,000 new workers joined unions in a single year, and all but 2 of the city's major industries were unionized by the late 1930s. Wages were up 50% from even pre-Depression figures, and unemployment had declined dramatically. For Racine's old and new immigrants, unionization had proved to be a valuable method of achieving prosperity and security. Many ethnic businesses also survived the Depression and continued to grow in the post-World War II boom. Even more importantly, the labor of parents and increased educational and business opportunities enabled immigrant-stock children to advance from the working class into professional, managerial, or business positions. By the 1940s, the city's Jewish community already boasted several physicians, dentists, lawyers, teachers, commercial artists, and accountants, as well as numerous proprietors of clothing, furniture, department, and jewelry stores. A recent sample of second-generation Italian Americans found that less than 1/4 were factory workers, with the remainder in business, professional, or managerial occupations. As many of the children of the new immigrants advanced to middle-class status, their place in the factories was largely taken by incoming blacks and Mexican Americans. The small number of blacks prior to World War I had largely operated small businesses, such as restaurants, shoeshine parlors, barber shops, or wood and coal stands, or worked as janitors, domestics, cooks, watchmen, porters, ushers, and tailors. The 1850 city directory revealed 5 black barbers, 4 laborers, 2 blacksmiths, 2 painters, and 2 sailors. There was even an occasional farmer around Franksville in Norway. The great influx during and after World War II, though, came seeking factory jobs. By the 1950s, blacks were a growing part of the labor force in almost every major factory in the city. And by 1960, over 75% of the black labor force was engaged in manufacturing. In 1966, 2/3 of the state's blacks were employed as drivers, deliverymen, laborers, and service workers, with about 35% working as machine operators. Almost 70% were unskilled laborers, only about 10% were craftsmen or foremen, and about 4% were professionals, managers, and sales personnel. The earliest Mexican Americans came as migrant farm laborers, often recruited by private labor agencies or the Wisconsin State Employment Service. Others worked in nearby canneries or on the railroad, especially in Sturtevant. By 1959, however, close to 80% engaged in manufacturing and only 3% in agriculture. Generally, black and Mexican American workers were in the lower paying jobs than the descendants of earlier settlers. Nearly two-thirds of them made less than $3 an hour in 1960, compared with only 35% of white workers. In 1965, the inner city core, inhabited largely by blacks and Chicanos, accounted for 43% of the city's unemployment. Nearly half the adult black males sampled had only a grade school education, and only 16% had any education beyond high school. The vast majority of blacks surveyed in 1971 believed that they were the victims of job discrimination and that there was little opportunity for better jobs in Racine. Many labor unions, having served as vehicles of economic improvement for white immigrants, proved reluctant to open their ranks to racial minorities, especially in time of economic downturn. Only about one-half of blacks and Mexican Americans felt that their children had a better chance for advancement than they had had, a view shared by less than a quarter of the white workers. Whether Racine's newest immigrants would be able to enjoy anything like the social mobility of their white predecessors was still an open question in the 1970s. Even if all forms of job and educational discrimination had been eliminated, the changing nature of the economy would have severely limited the opportunity for advancement. The increasing mechanization of industry had eliminated many of the laboring jobs used by earlier migrants as stepping stones to a better life, while the continuing centralization of business and finance had lessened the possibility for small neighborhood businesses upon which so many European immigrant families depended for a livelihood.
One of the strongest tendencies demonstrated by all of Racine's ethnic minorities was the desire to live among their fellow nationals, even among those who had come from the same village or region. As much as possible, they sought to transplant their old world institutions and culture into this new setting and to maintain a separate identity, language, religion, and culture. As a result, the county and the city early became a patchwork quilt of ethnic enclaves, whose outlines persisted well into the 20th century. Because cheap land was still abundant, most of the old immigrants were able to establish one or more settlements in the county towns. Nearly all these nationalities settled in some measure in Caledonia or Mount Pleasant because of its proximity to the city, but their major concentrations were often found elsewhere. The English established two major settlements in the early 1840s. The first at Yorkville consisted largely of Cornish miners on their way to the lead mining regions of southwestern Wisconsin. Nearly 200, however, went no farther than Racine County and farmed, too tired to go any further. From Yorkville, they spread out to Union Grove and other areas, but the former remained the pivot of their settlement. So many Englishmen and natives of the Channel Isles settled in the eastern portion of Rochester and the western half of Dover that the area was called English Settlement. Nearly all the land in the area was bought up within a 6-month period in 1842. The Scots, although far fewer in number, also established two colonies, the one north of the city, which they named Caledonia, and the other just east of English Settlement, which quickly became known as Scotch Settlement. Finding the land near the city too swampy, nearly 100 Welshmen began a concentration in the area between Union Grove and Franksville, with the main bodies at Pike Grove and Skunk Grove.
Although a few Irish families settled in nearly every town, the major concentrations were in Caledonia, Mount Pleasant, and Dover. In 1850, there were 25 Irish families in Mount Pleasant, 66 in Caledonia, and 120 in Dover. Only a small percentage of those in Mount Pleasant were engaged in agriculture, however. The bulk of the Irish, while living within the boundaries of the rural town, were in reality attached to the activities of the city. German immigrants settled on small farms of 50 to 80 acres on land that reminded them of the forested regions of Germany. Caledonia had 150 German families by 1860, mostly a spillover from heavily Germanic Franklin and Oak Creek in Milwaukee County, while over 500 Germans were found in Mount Pleasant by 1870. Their fellow countrymen were scattered all over the county, but especially in Burlington and Waterford. The city of Burlington, a 1920s historian noted, has steadily attracted settlers of that nationality, and even today it is predominantly German. Bohemian farmers from the Pilsen and Budweis areas flocked into Caledonia in the 1850s. By mid-decade, there were nearly 100 families. The eastern part of the town became so bohemian that it was dubbed Tabor, after the fortress erected by the Bohemians in their struggle against the Austrians. The small Dutch contingent in the county located near what later became the village of Sturtevant. There were so many Norwegians in the area between Waterford and Raymond that the town in the middle was named Norway. It was just south of the Milwaukee County village of Muskego, where the first Norwegians in Wisconsin had settled in the 1830s. In 1840, a colony moved south to Wind Lake, a settlement which soon became the center of Scandinavian immigration to the state in the 1840s, and the most important Norwegian settlement in the United States. From that base, Norwegian farmers moved east to North Cape and south to Union Grove, but Norway remained the nucleus of the new settlement, which extended into several towns of Racine County. Danish settlers concentrated in the eastern half of the county, settling in Raymond and Mount Pleasant and converging toward the middle in Yorkville. By 1870, there were already over 350 Danish settlers in Raymond. In the city, too, the old immigrants congregated into distinct ethnic enclaves. Before the bridges were built, Racine was divided by water into 3 separate sections. The north side was called Canada, the south side School Section, and the west side Sagetown. The original Yankee settlers congregated on the southeast side along the lakefront, just below the main business district. They later moved along West 6th Street and out to the Washington Avenue Junction, along with the industrialist New Rich. The old immigrant groups settled outside these areas, partly by choice, partly because they were excluded, and partly from economic necessity. Few had the financial resources to buy a home in the Yankee districts, and most needed to live within walking distance of their place of employment. The English and Scotch immigrants were generally highly skilled workers, and so religiously and culturally similar to the Yankees that they quickly blended in. The Welsh established an enduring enclave in the old 3rd Ward, just south of the business district between Main and Grand Streets. The early Irish settled north of the river in Canada, in the old 4th Ward. The majority were longshoremen, and the 1880 special census noted that their homes were naturally in sight of the river, and there they have remained. A smaller Irish colony was later founded on the south side by railroad workers, just east of the Northwestern Tracks and south of 10th Street. The Germans developed 2 settlements early in their history. One was on the north side of the 4th Ward, east of Milwaukee Street, between Kewanee and High Streets. The other was south of the business district and west of Main Street, running south to 16th Street. The early Bohemian community consisted largely of skilled craftsmen, intellectual freethinkers, and political liberals who were fleeing the unsuccessful revolution of 1848. They settled on the far north side, close to their farming brethren in Caledonia. The center of the community was at High and Milwaukee Streets, where currently stands the statue of Carol Jonas, the foremost Czech in America, editor of the first Bohemian language newspaper, author of several books, including a Bohemian English dictionary, state senator, lieutenant governor, and ambassador. He and his fellow intellectuals made Racine the center of Bohemian thought and culture in 19th century America, earning the city its designation as the Czech Bethlehem. Just west of the Germans and Bohemians along Milwaukee Avenue was the city's small Dutch colony. Scandinavians settled almost exclusively west of the Root River in Sagetown, the old 5th Ward. Although the great majority of Racine County Norwegians were rural dwellers, a sizable number settled north of State Street in order to be close to their jobs as sailors and dock workers. They were soon engulfed by the onrush of Danish immigrants coming to work in the wagon and farm implement factories and tanneries that were concentrated in Sagetown. With State Street as its center, the Danish community soon spread north to Hamilton Street, south to the river, and west to the city limits. By the 1890s, a Danish vanguard was already working its way southwest along the winding path of Washington Avenue as far as the junction. By 1905, no other county in the state had 1/3 as many Danes as Racine, and the city had the greatest per capita concentration of Danes of any city in the world outside Denmark itself. The Norwegians and Danes were joined by a smaller contingent of Swedes, who generally settled north of West 6th Street near the west city limits. By 1905, the 3 nationalities combined in Racine City and Mount Pleasant were said to constitute the largest Scandinavian settlement along the lakeshore of Wisconsin. The new immigrants who began arriving in the 1890s were equally desirous of establishing their own separate communities, but their choice of location was severely limited. There was virtually no uninhabited farmland left, and what there was far beyond their means. Agriculture was also becoming highly specialized and mechanical, a far cry from their old world experience. So only a few new immigrants moved onto abandoned farms or purchased them from older settlers. Even native-born Americans were moving off the farm and into the factories in substantial numbers. The new immigrants had no real alternative but to join the trend. In 1850, only 1/3 of the county's population lived in the city. By 1900, it was approaching 2/3. After 25 years of the new immigration, the figure stood at nearly 75%. Nearly all of the Lithuanian and Armenian immigrants in the county lived in the city in 1920, as did 88% of the Poles and Russians, 85% of the Yugoslavians, almost 80% of the Slovaks, and nearly 70% of the Italians and Hungarians. Most of those who did not live within the city limits lived in the lakeside section of Mount Pleasant, a continuation of the city's southeast side, and worked at the Case South Works, or Lakeside Malleable Iron. Over 1/3 of the foreign-born family heads in Mount Pleasant were of Italian, Hungarian, Slovak, Polish, Russian, or Lithuanian extraction. Within the city, the new immigrants were limited largely to the less desirable residential areas. The industrial explosion that affected much of the city engendered a parallel boom in working-class housing, since factory workers had to walk to work. A later Planning Commission report found that industry naturally located along the railroads, and after their establishment, homes for workmen surround these areas. Only the southwest part of the city is free of railroads and industries. The industrial belt followed the railroad tracks from Lakeside to the junction of the two major railroad lines around 16th Street. Farther north were the foundries and rubber plants along the northwestern tracks between Kewanee and Albert Streets, and the Massey Harris, Young Radiator Western Publishing Complex along 6th Street and the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul right-of-way. The meager financial resources of the new immigrants and the refusal of the older settlers to allow them into the better residential areas compounded the housing situation. Eventually, the Yankees and old immigrants, fearing the encroachment of the newcomers, moved north and west, leaving somewhat better housing. The extension of the North Shore Railroad to West Racine in 1911 opened up that previously isolated area. Yankees, Germans, and Scandinavians flocked there in large numbers. The neighborhoods they abandoned were quickly filled with Southern and Eastern Europeans, occupying the investment zone where the old residents had once been and had moved out into preferred residential zones. The Italians established two distinct communities, North Side and Lakeside. The former, near the foundries where most of the men worked, was bounded by High and Prospect Streets, north and south, and by Milwaukee and Carlisle Streets, east and west. The latter lay between the South City limits on 21st Street and the Case South Works, and between Lake Michigan and the Northwestern Railroad tracks. Eastern Europeans settled mostly on the south side, between the Industrial Junction and the lake, and south of 6th Street. The Lithuanians concentrated on the north edge of this section, between 9th and 12th Streets, on either side of the railroad tracks. The Poles settled primarily between 16th and DeKoven Streets, and between College and Racine Streets. This 14th Ward was over 40% Polish in 1920, and still nearly 1/3 that nationality 20 years later. The Slovaks settled in and around the Poles, from 16th Street south to the city limits, while the Hungarians lived primarily in Lakeside. Eastern Europeans established smaller colonies in the North Side Foundry District. The Greeks, mostly small shopkeepers or laborers at Case State Street plant, settled on the western fringe of the business district. The Armenians moved primarily into the State Street area, opening their small shops in buildings abandoned by the retreating Danes. The latter moved briskly along Washington Avenue and West 6th Street to West Racine, giving the area the strikingly Danish flavor that has caused it to be dubbed Kringleville. The Jews settled throughout the city, but mostly near the business districts north and west of the river. The pattern of resettlement reoccurred in the past 2 decades as the black and Mexican-American migrations increased in size. The earliest black settlers emulated their white counterparts in dividing between the city and the countryside. The 1860 census recorded 71 blacks in the city and 48 in the county towns, especially Caledonia, Norway, Mount Pleasant, and Yorkville. By 1880, however, all but a handful of the 103 blacks in the county lived in the city. It appears that early Negroes were not restricted to a single area of the city, an NAACP-sponsored report later noted. However, there appear to have been areas of concentration very early. The main location was along Grand Avenue, just south of the business district. Many of the black workers who came during World War II were housed in trailer camps on the outskirts of town, due to a combination of housing shortage and discrimination. Similarly, only 39 of the county's 61 Mexican Americans lived in the city in 1940. The rest were migrant farm workers living in Burlington, Wind Lake, and Sturtevant. The small number of Puerto Rican migrants generally settled in Union Grove, where they worked for the Meter Brothers Company. Over 95% of the mass migration of blacks and Spanish-speaking peoples in the past 3 decades, however, have located in the city and have been concentrated in the areas adjacent to the factory districts which were abandoned by the children of Southern and Eastern European immigrants. In 1975, only 17 of a sample of 60 Italian families still lived in Lakeside or Northside, and the 14th Ward was less than 15% Polish by 1960. Part of this concentration of blacks and Chicanos was due to similar conditions faced by earlier immigrants: poverty, lack of adequate housing, the need to live close to jobs, and the desire to preserve a distinct community and culture. Incoming Negroes move into neighborhoods with others who came from similar backgrounds, an Urban League official explained in 1960, just as we have our Polish, German, and Italian neighborhoods.
But by the 1950s, the city population was declining relative to that of the surrounding suburbs in Caledonia and Mount Pleasant. Moreover, there were few racial minorities living in West Racine, north of High Street, or east of Park Avenue. By the late 1960s, the city's minorities were located in 3 inner-city census tracts in a rough crescent running from 21st and Center Streets on the south, northwest along the west bank of the Root River to a point just opposite downtown, and northeast to Main Street and St. Patrick Street. In this zone were 90% of the county's blacks and nearly 65% of its Mexican Americans. The remainder were found largely in Lakeside or further south in the Barrio, the reception center in Sheridan Woods, where Mexican Americans lived until they found work and housing in the city. Only 30% of the city's white population lived in the same area.
In 1966, only 5% of the city's non-whites lived in housing built since 1950, and nearly 2/3 of it was classified as deteriorating or dilapidated. Only slightly more than 1/3 lived in single-family dwellings, and less than that owned their own homes. While the density per unit was higher than the city average, so was the rent, indicating that non-white minorities were paying more for less. Neighborhoods with substandard housing, a prominent black leader has noted, always go back to people that can't afford any more than that. Finally, a recent study discovered little evidence of residential mobility among the city's racial minorities. Between 1960 and 1970, fewer than 10% of the 516 sampled had moved out of the inner city core area. The research team, led by sociologist Lyle Shannon, found that most blacks and Chicanos who had moved between 1960 and 1970 were only moving around in the inner city. Gloomily, Shannon predicted in 1973 that the ghetto and the inner city will be larger, and even fewer Mexican Americans and Negroes will have the wherewithal to depart from it.
For nearly all of its existence, Racine has received a steady stream of new citizens from many ports of the world. For the first century, the inflow was composed largely of white Europeans, first from northern and western countries, and later from southern and eastern nations. In more recent times, the newcomers have been mostly southern blacks or Spanish-speaking migrants from Mexico and the American Southwest. No matter what their time of arrival or place of origin, all of them left their homelands to escape socioeconomic deprivation, religious persecution, or political oppression. They were attracted to Racine primarily because of its relative economic opportunity, religious toleration, and political freedom. They have provided the bulk of the labor force to build Racine and its products, as well as establish thousands of businesses that have added to the economy and the color of the city. Most, though not all, have enjoyed significant social mobility, at least over a few generations. Because of economic necessity, discrimination, and the desire to preserve their identity and culture, early groups banded together in ethnic enclaves, at least during the early years of settlement. The city was for generations a mosaic of ethnic neighborhoods, and many chose to remain with their own, even when they could afford to move to better housing. It is within these ethnic enclaves that all groups constructed the institutions that helped to facilitate their adjustment to urban industrial life while preserving the essentials of their identity and culture. It is to these institutions that we shall turn in the second portion of our investigation of Racine's ethnic groups.